Hello, today I'm going to be talking about Wizard and Glass, Book 4 in the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. And honestly, I told myself I wouldn't do this, that I wouldn't talk about the fourth book in the series when I don't have any videos out for books 1 through 3. I did the same thing with Malaz and Book of the Fallen, and it's a similar situation in which I started this series long before starting my channel, but I will give you a brief overview here in case you're curious. So I started this series back in 2019, yes, that long ago. And while I really enjoyed The Gunslinger, I just wasn't sure how I felt about a Western dystopian type of fantasy setting, if that was going to be something I felt an interest in. So I think that's why I didn't feel compelled to pick up consecutive books right away. But I did take my time and I picked up The Drawing of the Three, the second book, the following year. And I was so impressed with the characters that were introduced and the interesting timelines that were introduced in that particular book. That was something that was so unique and different, and it was totally not what I was expecting. And so I was just immediately intrigued by that second book. And then I picked up The Wastelands last year, and that book just blew me away. I loved the world building in that book and the atmosphere. There is something about this world that feels very distinct. Every time you read a Dark Tower book, you feel like you're very distinctly in this very distinct setting and atmosphere and feeling. I just can't really describe. And it's an amazing feeling. I feel really excited every time I pick up a book, which doesn't make sense why I'm spacing these books out to the extent I am, reading one a year. But I'm really enjoying my experience so far. And Wizard and Glass was no exception. So before getting into this, I will say that I did watch a non-spoiler review of this book on Philip Chase's channel. And I'm so glad I did that because he did talk a lot about the framed narrative structure of the book, as well as the two quotes at the beginning that foreshadow these two different parts of the book. And you will definitely see what he's talking about. I definitely kept the quotes in mind as I read on in the book, and they definitely pointed to some important themes and symbols that you see throughout the story. And this book also takes place after a huge cliffhanger at the end of book 3. And the way it resolves was pretty interesting. I know that there might be some mixed feelings about that. I actually liked the way it was resolved personally. And I did watch a spoiler-filled discussion of this book over on the Codex Cantina channel, and they do talk about that at length. And they also talk about another Stephen King book that is referenced in this first part of the book, which I don't want to say much because of spoilers. I don't know if it is a spoiler to say that, but anyway, I really enjoyed what the Codex Cantina had to say. And another thing that the Codex Cantina had to say was about how this backstory of Roland, which takes place in this place called Magus in Midworld, it's so incredibly atmospheric again, but also it really does have a Western feel to it. So it's very much like a Western story, and yet it's not in our world, but it references our world, but it's still very distinctly fantasy. And the way that King is able to do that, I think, shows his brilliance as a writer. I think that the best fantasy writers are able to create a world that feels so real, you almost forget it's not real, and still borrows elements from our world, but still make it distinctly fantasy, while at the same time having characters that feel very distinctly from that world, and having the story so good that it's a good story on its own, despite anything else. So I think that King just does such an amazing job about that. But something that the Codex Cantina brought up in their video is how this particular world has Westworld vibes. If you've ever watched that show on HBO, I only watched the first season, but I was so glad they brought that up in their discussion, because when I was reading this book, I couldn't stop thinking of Westworld when I read that particular section of the book. And I was just so, again, impressed with everything about this setting and just understanding Roland as a character. So getting to know Roland as a character, I should say, this was what was so fascinating to me, because I mentioned before how King plays with time, and time actually is brought up in an interesting way a couple of times in this book. But one thing that I have found so compelling about the Dark Tower series so far is how you have characters who come from different timelines, and yet they're all very different, but they feel like they're distinctly from their timeline. Like they feel like you definitely pulled them out at the right time. I don't know how he does it. I felt the same way when I read 11/22/63 by Stephen King. Like the characters that he describes in those eras felt very distinct to those eras. There is no exception here with Roland, because Roland, even though this is a fantasy world where Roland comes from especially, it's not our world, but he feels very distinctly from that world. And he definitely is a gunslinger, and it makes sense. Everything just makes sense in this amazing way. And by the way, I did do a video on my favorite time travel stories. I didn't mention the Dark Tower, though I definitely think that the Dark Tower could qualify as having time travel. I think it's fair to say that. I'm just so impressed though with the way that Magus was brought to life. It was not actually a very healthy society, honestly, but there were very specific traditions. There were specific types of seasonal events, the end of the year kind of celebrations, a sort of reaping ceremony. I really enjoyed just those sort of cultural elements that are tied in, and how people just accept them as normal, and the way that the people kind of interact with one another. You get so immersed in this story, in Roland's backstory, you almost forget it's a backstory. At least I did. So I was just so impressed with that. And this particular story has one of my favorite tropes, which is forbidden love. I know I keep saying that, and I haven't read very much in the way of romance or things that have that trope, but I think that the way it was handled was very skillful. I know that there is a Romeo and Juliet quote, going back to what Philip Chase mentioned in his review, and there is kind of, I think, there are some questions for some people. Why didn't Romeo and Juliet just run away? And I feel like the way that Stephen King answered that, he did it so skillfully. It's like you read this book and you have a sense of dread, because you know it's Stephen King. You know who Roland is in the present. You know he's haunted by some things that happened in his past. So you know things are going to go wrong. I think it's safe to say that. But how they go wrong is what's so fascinating. And something that King does so well, and I've just noticed this in his stories, and it's a very simple kind of plot device, I think, to get a story moving forward, is he plants these certain events that characters are looking forward to. And you know things are supposed to go a certain way for these events. And I mean, you see that in all books, right? There's usually a mission or something, but usually it's timed to a specific day and time and thing happening. And I like that. I know that's a very simple kind of plot device, but I really love the way King uses that. I felt that way when I read 11/22/63, where I just couldn't wait to get to 11/22/63. It just built up so much suspense in me. So I did feel like the plot, in other words, in this book was very good. The pacing was very good, but the story was just beautifully executed. The character dynamics were incredible. And I think that one thing that King does so well is he brings to life these sort of seeds of character development. So you look at things that might be a virtue, like willpower or steadfast loyalty, not willing to give up, and you turn those things around to show them as sort of darker traits, and they suddenly become obsession, compulsion. And you see how things can go wrong with just a small shift. And the thing that I loved the most about this book, in addition to exploring those kinds of themes of addiction and obsession and compulsion, and how those are maybe deeper than the thing itself that you are addicted to, I think that might be something there. I'm not totally sure. But I also wondered too, one thing that really, really spoke to me about this book was the way in which characters changed. Because there were specific moments throughout the story in which characters would suddenly change. Whether they would change by putting up a boundary between themselves and another person, or themselves and a belief, or just change allegiance in some way. Every time it happened, I can think of this with 3 different characters in mind at least. Every single time it happened, it felt like there were reverberations throughout the world. Like I could feel the echoes of this throughout the world. That's something that is so interesting, again, is just the world itself. There's a consciousness to it, I think. I get a sense of that. And I feel like there's still so much that's mysterious about it. But those moments were so powerful. And one other thing I want to bring up, kind of related to this, was the way that jokes are used in this story, both at the beginning of the story and at the end. And that's all I will say, because I think they were very important moments in the book. So those are things I would point to when you're reading this book. I guess I'll add though that there were some very strange things that happened at the end of the book that I wasn't totally sure how I felt about, but I'm trying to suspend my judgment until I read on in this series before making a final decision on how I felt about those things. But overall, I really loved this story. I'm excited to read on in the Dark Tower series. And let me know down in the comment section below if you've read this book, if you're planning to read it. I'd love to hear from you. And have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.